Good morning, or at least good morning for many of you. Welcome to the first in a series of webinars from the RIMS Technology Association. Today's webinar is Enterprise Risk Management, the Final Frontier, and is sponsored by Origami Risk. Origami is a leading risk and insurance technology platform serving all members of the risk management community, from insured, corporate, and public entities to insurance carriers, brokers, TPAs, and risk consultants. We are going to discuss today what is ERM, Enterprise Risk Management. You'll probably hear us call it ERM going forward. How organizations are implementing ERM and how technology can play an important role in a successful ERM program. But first, let me introduce the RIMS Technology Association. The association is a free resource for all things RIMS and risk technology. We hope to build a community around people who are interested in and involved in this space. Little logistics for today. First of all, we are recording this session and we'll make it available online for anyone at a later time. And there will be a link in the follow-up email after today's session. All participants are in a listen-only mode. If you have any questions for the panel or for me, you can submit those through the GoToWebinar control panel under questions, and we'll do our best to answer those questions as we receive them during the course of the webinar. So let me introduce now the panel for today's discussion. First, I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Patrick O'Neill, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. I am the president and founder of Red Hand Advisors. Red Hand helps organizations maximize their investment in risk technology. I'm also the co-author and publisher of the RIMS Report, a widely read annual guide to the risk management information system industry, downloaded each year by more than 2,000 risk professionals. Prior to forming Red Hand, I spent the bulk of my career in the RIMS space. I was a founding member of the RIMS business at Marsh. I'd like to welcome now Roy Hock. Roy is the Senior Manager of Risk at Pacific Drilling SA, an international ultra-deepwater drilling contractor. Roy has 20-plus years of experience in the risk management and insurance space and has been with Pacific Drilling since 2012. He currently oversees insurance, claims, and enterprise risk management for Pacific Drilling. And prior to joining them, Roy worked for Allianz Insurance Services as a commercial account manager with a specialty in risk management. So welcome, Roy.
Thank you.
Next is Brandon Thompson. Brandon's a leader in the enterprise risk management and governance and risk compliance technology space. He has over 14 years experience assisting clients with ERM and GRC technology implementations. He brings a unique blend of technical expertise and business understanding to client engagements at Origami, where he joined in 2018. Prior to joining Origami, Brandon served as Director of GRC Technology at KPMG, where he focused on assisting clients with developing strategies for enterprise transformation. And finally, Joshua Newsom. So Josh is an experienced GRC professional with extensive practical and technical expertise in audit, risk, and compliance. As a senior practice lead of ERM at Origami Risk, Josh spearheads all ERM and GRC design and roadmap efforts. Josh joined Origami in 2018 and is focused on working for and with GRC customers to ensure their programs are creating efficiencies and value within their organizations. Prior to Origami, Josh worked for another GRC provider. During his time there, his focus was on designing tailored implementations experiences. Over the course of his career, Josh has also served as a risk and audit manager and implemented GRC solutions firsthand as a customer. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the panel today. So let's jump right into this. And Josh, maybe you can start us off. Maybe you can help set a baseline for us, for everyone, and define what we're talking about today in terms of enterprise risk management.
Absolutely. Thanks, Pat. Good morning, everybody. So as Pat alluded to, it's good to make sure that we've got a level understanding of what enterprise risk management means. We certainly understand that the folks in today's session probably span a lot of different experiences and maturity levels within this ERM space. With that said, we also understand that there's numerous definitions of ERM, and it probably means something a little bit different to each of us on the call today, and it's unique in the way that it is defined and implemented within each of our organizations. More from a definition standpoint, folks recognize enterprise risk management as a process of planning, organizing, and controlling the activities in the organization so they can manage the risks with the goal of seizing the opportunities that are related to the achievement of those objectives. So what does that actually mean? That means, how are we identifying the risks within the organization? How do we associate that to business or corporate or strategic level objectives and goals with our organization, so that we can understand what's the impact and likelihood of a risk event occurring within our company, but also how does that promote or prevent us from meeting those types of objectives that we have documented. More historically, folks have thought of ERM as a ability to look at a risk, score a risk, and create a risk register and a heat map. And I think what we're trying to promote is that ERM is more than just a static point in time dot on a heat map, and that risks are actually opportunities and threats that also fit along with the risk appetite and tolerance of our organization. So we understand that, of course, we need to evaluate the threat that a risk poses to our organization, but there's calculated opportunities and activities associated with risks that drive value within our organizations. Additionally, just understanding your risk doesn't really provide the full story to your organization or provide enough value back to your board or your management or your committees. And so what we talk a lot about is, how do we use the risk, the identification of the risk and the assessment process to drive decision-making with our organization. So essentially, how is it preventing our organization from meeting objectives, and how do we give that board or committee something tangible to make decisions off of? With that said, we also are big believers of the overall risk governance and maintaining full contextual awareness around the risk within our organization. So for each of the risks that we've identified, how does that touch on each part of our organization? Do our business entities or business units or certain locations, does the risk mean something differently to each of them? What about compliance areas and standards? How does it impact those? And so taking a full view of who does the risk apply to and how does that apply differently across the organization is a very valuable context. And then finally, as we think about our risks relative to our risk appetite and our tolerance, where are the disconnects? You know, organizations aren't all completely risk averse. So they have some level of appetite for risk across the universe of the risks within the organization. It's where that gap exists that we really start to have talking points. And then we make smart decisions about those risks. So do we choose to accept them, mitigate them, avoid them, and transfer them? And you'll hear a lot about all of these topics throughout the course of the call and some real world examples from Laura with Pacific Drilling.
Great, Josh. Thank you. I think that's a good baseline for our discussion. It seems, I think we all know, ERM is very broad. It's a very broad term, and it encompasses many different activities. Hey, Brandon, maybe you can give us a little sense for what is that kind of broad spectrum of ERM and the different levels. As you do that, I'm actually going to post a poll for our audience to reply to get a sense of where our attendees are in their spectrum of ERM. So, Brandon, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll post the poll.
Thanks, Pat. As Josh mentioned, there's a lot of components to ERM, and data and technology are really only two of them. To have an effective ERM program, you must also have an established risk appetite. Start by asking yourself, has your organization articulated the level of risk the enterprise is willing and able to accept? Have they defined not only what is acceptable and on strategy, but also what risks are undesirable or off strategy? Have they defined strategic, financial, and operational risk parameters? Risk appetite is also a dynamic set of assertions, so there must be an ongoing dialogue to make sure it's adjusting to the market and company performance. You also have risk strategy, ensuring that the risks identified, monitored, and managed are in alignment with the strategic objectives of the organization. There's risk culture, that tone from leadership and those values and behaviors present throughout an organization that shape the risk-related decisions. Encouraging appropriate risk management behavior at every level of the organization via formal and informal processes, effective communication and education, and ultimately holding all three lines of defense accountable for managing risks. Once these elements are in place, then you can get into the more traditionally thought about pieces of ERM relative to technology and data, such as defining a risk register with your risk categorized in a multi-level risk taxonomy, associating mitigating controls to those risks. We'll also want to tie risks back to the strategic objectives of the organization, to governance such as policies, frameworks, and standards, to special projects, to new initiatives, to processes, and maybe even products, depending on your industry. And these relationships are important because they give us lenses through which we can assess, view, and monitor the risk landscape. And of course, having reports, dashboards, and heat maps to communicate insight into the strengths and weaknesses of risk management activity. Effective risk reporting really enhances the transparency of risk that could have an impact on achieving objectives. Those are the pieces that we're talking about when we say ERM. And based on those components, we kind of put organizations into the following 5 buckets of maturity. The first is either weak or non-existent. So the risk management processes and frameworks are undocumented, inconsistent, or lack clarity. The risk management activities are not aligned with business strategy, and risk is not consistently considered as business decisions are made. Probably, or the next section is sustainable. And this is probably where a majority of companies exist today. The business is doing the minimum to meet the expectations of stakeholders, both internal and external. Some of the activities are defined, but there's a lot of variance across the 3 lines of defense. This is where you'll see limited and inconsistent use of a technology platform. And finally, there's not much focus on emerging risks or on scenario analysis. Third is mature. So the board and the executives are showing increased confidence that risk is being effectively managed based on the identification of emerging risks, external benchmarking, and the use of things like risk appetite, tolerances, and risk limits. Activities are aligned with the business strategy, but while corporate risk management functions demonstrate consistency, maybe the remote entities, are not truly integrated in that process. The 4th level of integrated risk management capabilities and activities are coordinated across both the corporate side and those remote entities. Common tools and processes are being used with enterprise-wide risk monitoring, measurement, and reporting. You'll start to see that proactive change management exists across all 3 lines of defense. And then finally, the advanced bucket. This is where risk management activities are fully embedded in strategic planning, capital allocation, and in the daily decision-making. An early warning system is in place to notify the board and management of risks above established thresholds. And finally, risk management is serving as a source of competitive advantage to the organization.
So Brandon, I think you probably can see the results from the poll. I know you said that most people, I think you were saying in your experience, that are at kind of the sustainable level, which is what our audience kind of polls in at today. Any surprises there from the results?
Honestly, only in the 3% that mark themselves as advanced, because perhaps they should be the ones speaking up and telling us how they're doing it.
We're going to add, if we could, we could add them to the panel for the discussion today.
There you go.
All right. Well, let's thank you for that. So, Roy, let's get you in on this discussion. Appreciate you participating. Maybe you can help us a little with kind of how, what led Pacific Drilling down the ERM route. Roy, you there?
Thanks, Pat. And I don't think we would even consider ourselves at the advanced level yet, but we are pretty far down the road with our ERM program. So I think, as with many people, this was a board edict back in 2013 to create an ERM program here at Pacific Drilling. And specifically, it came from our audit committee. So for our company, the ERM rolls up through that committee at the board level. To kind of check the box, first off, back in 2013, we hired a third party to come in and do a high-level risk assessment. That satisfied the requirement of the board, but what it didn't do is give us the likelihood and impact and the tie-in to the day-to-day activities at Pacific Drilling that we were really looking for as a company. So in 2014 and 15, the audit group here at Pacific set about developing the risk assessments, identifying more risks, the mitigations that go with them, and who owns what. I will say during that process, it was a very fluid time as far as how we wanted to categorize the risks, how we wanted to define the risks, and it changed probably, from what I can tell in the documentation, probably 5 times during that period. I came on board to help out and take over the ERM strategy in late 2017, and over the course of last year, we worked on aligning our risks with the new COSO framework, tying them to our strategic objectives and initiatives of the company, trying to develop a kind of coherent language so that we're all talking the same language of risk here at the company, which was not in place at the time. We also expanded into some BCM and some other items surrounding and coming out of the ERM program findings. And that's pretty much where we're at today. We are looking at expanding our program, moving it into other levels of the organization, and utilizing a REMIS tool to help us do that.
Great. Roy, thank you very much. So, Brandon, what Roy just described in those kind of early goings when they first started, and then I think from maybe what we saw in the poll results in terms of where a majority of the audience is, I mean, if it was straightforward, everyone would have this in place. So I got to imagine that there's some challenges when implementing a process like this at an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a few things that you're going to want to be on the lookout for. The first is on the approach. Should you go process before technology or allow technology to lead the process? So every company's ERM program is going to be unique, but all of them will generally follow the same process steps. So there's really 2 schools of thought on this. One is that the process should lead. What an organization would do, excuse me, is fully define their process, all of their requirements, reports, etc., and then engage a technology vendor that can meet what's been laid out. The second approach is to see what the technology can do and then tweak your process or the software so that the 2 align. This approach is especially valuable if you already own the software, maybe from the REMIS side or as part of another platform. But the 2 drivers of which approach is going to be right for your organization are going to be, first, have you already bought a tool that you are committed to? This can be important because if you're already committed to a tool and you don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time defining a process that it can't support, and at the same time, you want to take advantage of all the things that it can do well. The other driver is how much time and budget can you afford to spend? Generally speaking, having the process lead is the preferred way to approach these types of implementations, but it also tends to cost more. If you're an organization that's slightly less mature or one that is trying to get something up and running in a relatively short amount of time or on limited budget, then perhaps taking a proven solution as your starting point with minimal configuration is the way to go. It actually reminds me of a story from a conference I attended back in the SOX days, so probably around 2006 or so. The first client presentation, the presenter talked about how within 18 months they had gone from a completely paper process to implementing the system. They spent around $1 million, but now they were fully SOX compliant. And the very next client presentation got up, and that company had only invested around $200,000 and maybe 3 months converting their data and training their users and that kind of thing. And he ended it by saying, we too are SOX compliant. And it was really striking to see the differences in their approaches and the amount of effort that went into what was essentially the same overall goal. So knowing the approach that makes the most sense for your organization before you begin really is key. Another thing to look out for is misaligned expectations. And this is common across all technical implementations, not just ERM, but it really stresses the importance of defining a vision and strategy up front so that everyone is clear on what you're trying to achieve and where you intend to go. Nothing will kill end user buy-in faster than getting something different than what was being communicated and what was expected. Another pitfall is the aggregation of scoring. So how will you as a company roll up scores to different levels throughout the risk hierarchy? Will you take high watermark, weighted averages, et cetera? And will the roll-up be purely mathematically driven, or will there be subjective input as well? Trying to define that up front is going to be key. And lastly, the qualitative versus quantitative approach. So when performing a risk assessment, will you be more subjective in your scoring, or will you use numerical values to try to get more precision? Qualitative is, of course, easier to set up and use, but may not provide the level of detail that management is looking for, where quantitative may require complex formulas and additional time to gather all the necessary data required to accurately utilize the assessment. So those are some of the key pitfalls that we see.
Great, thanks, Brandon. So I guess whether you lead with process or you lead with technology, technology certainly plays a role, and that's one of the things we wanted to discuss today. Josh, maybe you can talk a little bit about what technology's role, whether it leads or follows, in a successful ERM program, and how it can support the process.
Right, and the technology can frankly be the success or the failure of an ERM program in a lot of cases. Thinking about Brandon's points, if we don't have a well-defined process, the technology is only as good as the process that's been put into place. And so that's often why process is generally the leader of how we originate the ERM programs. Generally, what we would find is that an organization puts the process in place and is starting from a point of many manual processes. So there's a lot of heavy investment in utilization of spreadsheets and SharePoints and report generation, what I would call offline. So a lot of manual effort to really promote that ERM process. Now, where technology comes into play is to start to make that process more efficient. So now that we've got that level of buy-in within the organization, and we've defined what a risk assessment process means, and we have determined what our objectives are for our reporting back to the board or committee, the technology can spearhead that movement. And what that gets you essentially is a couple of things. One, of course, you have a more transparent view of the risks across your organization. Of course, you can look at a spreadsheet and say, here's my list of 100 risks, but it's easier to utilize a solution that helps you evaluate what are all the touch points of those risks across your organization in a way that you might not get from a manual type of process. Additionally, again, it just helps you understand that risk exposure to your organization across either single risks or pools or buckets of risks or categories of risk. And where this can be valuable is really thinking about that risk appetite and tolerance standpoint. And when we think about what we're presenting back to our boards or our committees, it's usually not just, well, here's what is the result of a risk assessment, but here's that delta again between the risk tolerance and appetite of a risk or a pool of risks versus what we were willing to take on. And that's where we see technology shine, because it helps present that story in a better picture than if we were going through more of a manual process. And of course, automated workflows. We all know that if we have a manual process without technology supporting us, there's a lot of follow-up with the folks that we're going through the assessment process with, a lot of emails, a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of back and forth. This is really a pretty heavy manual effort, and organizations tend to find immediate ROI when they move to a piece of technology, just from the hours that they're saving on all of these manual processes. Of course, what this means is, one, we have greater transparency into where we're at in the process. It allows those automated workflows to take shape, but it also means that we can get that time back into our ERM program and actually spend the time focusing on the problems or the issues or the remediations instead of tracking down what's the status of an assessment or how do I create my reports and charts offline in a way that is suitable for management or my board or committee. Additionally, again, more from that transparent standpoint, if we think about how that plays into the risks and the ratings, that also carries over into management. So instead of having a static or point of time type of result, management has the ability to take a look at any single moment into what's the status of the process, how are the risks rating, what are the things that actually mean something to me within my purview of my organization. And then finally, the ability to start documenting and tracking key indicators and cost of control. So this is where you start to see programs scale. So it's a little easier to take programs to the next level or bring them forth further into the organizations as technology helps support that process.
Great, thank you. I want to remind the audience if you have any questions for the panel, please post them in the questions box in the control panel, and we'll try to answer those as we go along. So, excuse me. I think we've set a good framework talking about kind of technology and process and what ERM is. I think maybe we can get into a little deeper now and talk about kind of what are the key steps or roadmap in implementing a successful ERM process and technology. Brandon, maybe you can talk about that a little for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Pat. So the first step is going to definitely be around defining a vision and strategy. So you need to start with the goal in mind, and that begins with documenting the overall program vision. What do you want to achieve? How do you intend to get there? And when do you want to achieve it? By establishing these boundaries and setting some guiding principles for the program, you'll be better set up for long-term success. The next step is in defining some common language and other foundational items that are important regardless of the technology you'll ultimately be using. So for example, putting in place a risk taxonomy that all risks must tie back to. You'll need an agreed upon scoring methodology considering risk factors like financial, reputational, strategic, and operational impacts. It's important that these things are documented and agreed to, especially when you consider that it's likely in the future that the ERM program will be interacting with other risk assurance functions across the company. And we want to make sure that what is considered a high rated risk for one area is clear to others. The third step is process definition. So what are the roles that will be involved in the risk management process, and what specific steps will they be responsible for? Once you've defined this process, you'll want to take a step back and think about the inputs and the outputs of data for each one. Are there efficiencies that can be found through either automation or through simplification? And as you move through the various stages of maturity with your program, you'll find that having things such as this documented will not only make things more consistent, but will also be helpful in guiding new contributors to the risk management activities, as they'll be better able to understand where they fit into the larger picture. Next is business requirements. So now that you've documented the activities in your process, the next step is to define the individual requirements that will drive the process. For example, do you want to have a workflow process in place so that risk assessments submitted by risk owners must be approved by someone in the ERM department before being published? What kind of data attributes should be captured when you're documenting a new control? Who should have access to see the risk assessment results? These requirements should ultimately be broken up into what is required versus what is a nice to have. And if you're looking for a technology provider, many of these can go directly into an RFP you submit to get a better understanding of whether the software vendors will be able to meet your needs or not. Fifth is preparing the organization for change. And this is something that often gets overlooked and underestimated when it comes to the level of effort in preparing the people in your organization for the program changes that you're making. Driving the culture to consider risk in their daily activities at all three lines of defense is going to take some time. So you want to have both a communication and education strategy in place to get the most buy-in. Sixth is enabling via technology. So once you've defined your vision, your common language, your process steps, and your requirements, you're ready to enable it all via an enterprise risk solution. If you're currently working on spreadsheets and shared drives, you should immediately see benefits of moving to a software tool. Having all of your risk assessment data and activities in one place, the ability to have workflow and access rights, and generating custom reports for leadership are just some of the reasons why implementing an ERM solution will benefit your organization. And the seventh step, the last step, is continuous improvement. So this is another thing that is often overlooked, and it's putting time on the roadmap for ongoing improvements. Your program will evolve. The software solution will continue to evolve. New guidance is going to come out for frameworks and standards like COSO and ISO. So your plan should really include time to reevaluate what you have and make those improvements.
Brandon, I appreciate it. Roy, maybe you could share some of the benefits that Pacific Drilling has seen in adopting an ERM strategy.
Yeah, for sure. I also like to reiterate what Josh and Brandon just said, because it's so important to kind of have your program at least somewhat established as far as how you want it to look, how you want to assess, who's going to do the assessing, before you start customizing or adjusting a REMIS system to do it for you. Because like I said, in the past, they had gone through like 5 iterations, 5 different heat maps, risk tolerance, appetites, all over the place. Different people were looking at risks, and that's not what it looks like today. So through trial and error, we got to a place where we were, for all better words, stable enough that it was a logical transition into a REMIS system to help us build in those efficiencies, create more standardization, allow that clarity into our risk as a company. But I think prior to that, they were still really muddling around in the water and just trying to figure it out. So I think had they tried to implement it at that position, they would have been having to change the system so often, it really wouldn't have given them much benefit. That being said, I'd also like things that we are starting to get from using a REMIS system, or beginning to use a REMIS system, is, like I said, efficiencies. We're a small department. We need, we can't have a bunch of people out doing interviews all the time. So getting that into a very user-friendly access point for our risk assessors was very important. We also realized that we needed to move beyond the executive team and go down into maybe the next level of managers or even their subordinates. And using a tool, our REMIS system, is the easiest way to get that impact and get that to view of our risks from a broader population of the company, therefore giving us a more accurate reflection of what the risk is, as well as what the risk score is, which is very important to us, and what we want to show to not just to our board of directors now, but also to outside clients who may want to look at this type of information.
Roy, actually, we have a couple of questions that might segue well from your position. Now, first, I think back to Brandon's description earlier, do you know if Pacific Drilling started with process or technology when they went down?
We definitely started with process. Unless you consider Excel spreadsheets and Word documents technology, which technically I guess it is.
Yeah, I think the technology folks on the phone would take exception to that, but
Microsoft might have a different idea.
Second question, actually, right in line with what you just talked about. What's the buy-in been like from the rest of the organization with this process? You talked a little bit about expanding it, but what about buy-in and being involved?
I do feel like, especially reading back through the notes and looking at those early assessments, that the initial buy-in was really because it's a requirement from the board of directors. That was kind of the big stick approach, if you get my drift. Now I think we have a more understanding, so the folks who are doing the assessing at this level understand what they're looking at, they understand the assessments. However, new people come on board, and so you have to kind of potentially pull out the big stick again on occasion. But once you get them to understand it and you're starting to talk the same language, I feel like the buy-in becomes inherent within the conversations, after the conversation.
Thank you, and thank you for the questions from our participants. So, Josh, you've got an interesting background. I mean, when we introduced you before, you've been implementing systems, but you've also implemented them as a client as well. So, maybe you can share some other benefits you've seen either in your own experiences or with other clients when implementing an ERM strategy.
Yeah, absolutely, Pat. And I think it's important to think about what we're both sides of the outcomes of this. So on a positive side, of course, where did I or where are other customers seeing value out of a technology and ERM type of strategy, or what are steps that they took to become successful? On the other side of that, what kind of struggles did they wish they had? If you were able to take a look backwards and say, well, I wish we would have done this different, we can look at what a couple of those things were as well. So I'll actually work a bit backwards. So more from a struggle standpoint, what we often hear is customers and myself included, just making sure that we had the right decision makers in place for moving into an ERM program, and frankly, even more so important when we actually move into the technology part of an ERM program. So somebody that could actually help guide the decision-making process relative to what type of scoring decisions are we going to make, what type of workflows do we have, what kind of acceptance are we going to have within the organization if we are to implement new processes, and whether that's a combination of a project manager or some sort of executive sponsor within the organization. Without those in place, whether you're just implementing a new process or new pieces of technology, we often find that folks in this space will struggle. Also talking about a defined output. So what is it that we're trying to produce? So we know that if we are looking at identifying what our risks are and creating some level of assessment and reporting, we can go through that process. But what is actually being asked of the enterprise risk management team by the board or committee? Are they looking for heat maps or specific decision-making processes or reporting? If we don't ask the question of what helps drive value as part of this program, then we're missing the mark. So asking that question early on in this process really helps support folks that have had successful ERM rollouts. And actually, the rollout strategy is the next part of frankly, the struggle and the positive outcomes. So when we think about the rollout strategy, we can't just take a new process or a new technology and say, here you go to the rest of the organization. You often don't have the level of buy-in, or it interrupts the daily workflow of people's day jobs, so to speak. And frankly, you're destined for failure if you're thinking that rolling it out across the board, enterprise-wide, is generally a way that will lead to success. More from a positive standpoint, though, so what we're often finding is folks that have implemented technology immediately see efficiency in that risk identification and assessment process. So you heard me talk before about just the increased transparency in that risk assessment results in the reporting. This process is just made easier. Just the pure savings on time alone brings value to an organization very quickly. And again, then they can spend more time focusing on the problem areas. So if there's an assessment where the exposure is greater than the organization is willing to tolerate, we can then move into thinking about what are the mitigation steps or the control activities that would help more align our appetite of risk versus what the level of raw risk is to our organization. We also talk about the enhancement or the development of that risk culture into the organization. And this happens over time, but folks that have implemented ERM solutions, and whether they're manual or through a piece of technology, often find value in that strategic goals and objectives and plannings becomes part of this process. And they can start expanding it out to vendor processes and ad hoc type of projects. And I use the ERM technology piece as a good example all the time. So what are the risks associated with IT-related implementation activities or construction projects or capital type improvements within your organization? So going beyond just enterprise-wide risk assessment and developing that risk culture into the decision-making processes across each of your companies. But then also thinking about smart, scalable programs. So what's your organization's appetite for getting into enterprise risk, and how do you value it being successful, or how do you get to a point where it can be successful? Always thinking about what's next. So you may be at a place where you're only able to identify the risks in, say, year 1 or year 2 of a program, but setting yourself up for success with saying, well, what is it that we can do now, and how can we move into expanded use cases in the future? And maybe those are things about like identifying the controls and the remediation strategies, are starting to define those KRIs or metrics around what triggers could be for assessment, or what are pain points in this process that might say raise that red flag as part of this. And then finally, how do we evaluate the overall program? So from an ROI standpoint, when we talk to customers that have implemented ERM solutions, especially the technology element, they can start to quantify what type of ROI there is relative to the work that they've been doing, and frankly, make that tie-in to those corporate objectives and strategic goals and objectives of that organization. And that's really useful information to start giving back to the boards or the committees.
Great information. Thank you, Josh. I appreciate it. So, Roy, maybe circle back. I got to imagine even in the time period you've been involved with the ERM process at Pacific Drilling, there's been some lessons learned along the journey. Could you share some of those with us?
For sure. I guess coming at this as a risk manager by profession, I kind of assumed that a lot of people spoke my language, so to speak. And one of the biggest lessons learned for me personally is that is not true. For instance, just the other day, I was doing a risk interview, and we do that, and I still think they provide a considerable amount of value, even if you're in a REMIS system. The gentleman who was a new assessor to some old risks that were not his originally, basically told me, that's my job. Those aren't risks to the company. That's my job. That's what I do. So they can't be risks to the company. So it started an interesting conversation, an educational conversation on both sides. But we got him to understand that, it's still a risk. What you're doing and what you're implementing are, controls or mitigations to that risk. And then trying to teach him how to think about how to assess that risk and learn about how our impact and likelihood scales work. And so it's not inherent. People don't know this stuff. And it's a conversation that has to be had if you're ever going to implement a good ERM program. Other things that I've learned is that you have to establish a risk language so that everyone can understand what you're talking about. Just like in any other industry, there's tons of acronyms here. There's on the offshore drilling contractor side, we have plethora. On the insurance side, there's more than you can imagine, as you can imagine actually. And trying to make sure that when you guys are sitting down talking about risk, or when they're looking at a screen and the risk is being described, that it's described and shown in such a way that it's very understandable to everybody, that when a person reads it, everybody's reading the same thing. And that way their assessment of that risk has validity across the entire ERM program. So that's another big takeaway that, those first few years of it that I took out of that and started looking at last year and implementing it this year, or implementing it last year and this year continuing. And kind of like what I see next for us as a company is utilizing the efficiencies and assessment tools built into a REMIS system, in our case it is Origami, to help with the process. It's not the end-all, be-all, nose to tail for the process, but it is, halfway or more getting us where we need to be so that we can be more automated and more efficient. But like I said, you still have to talk to people, you still have to educate people, and sometimes you really can't do that through a system. But the system can come in on the back end and make the processing so much more efficient, so much more usable, and give you an end product which you can take to the board in real time and say, look, here's where we are in the process. Here's how the risks are being assessed. Here's where we're at as a company. Here's what we think we should be doing. Take this risk or don't take this risk. Is this an opportunity or not an opportunity? Those are the things that it's going to help us give clarity to and pass up to the board level. And like I said, we've actually had clients starting to ask us about some of this ERM stuff as part of their tendering process. So it's becoming more important, not just internally, but externally as well. So that's really where I see us going, is this being able to provide that to all those different parties and stakeholders.
Right. So we got a couple more questions from the audience. Roy, you may have a comment, and then maybe Brandon and Josh can comment more broadly. Let me see if I can ask this question specifically. Is there one person who works or focuses on ERM solely, or does this fall on the risk manager to manage and ensure everyone is updating and is on track with the risk mapping and implementation solutions? And they follow up on that, the same was what they mean by that is, is this something that typically you see, and maybe this part's for Brandon and for Josh, that this is part and parcel with the risk management responsibilities? Is it separate? Roy, you introduced yourself earlier that you've got responsibility over both, but what's happening out in the corporations in terms of that?
I think different companies approach it differently. The size of the companies, the number of people that are available. Here at Pacific, it's myself and a couple of other people who assist me to make this work, and that's kind of where we're at. But primarily, the responsibility is mine. But I, as risk manager, I'm running it up through the audit side of our company, so it falls under the audit trail, so to speak. Whereas in other companies, it may go through legal, or it may go through other silos. That's a bad word these days, I know, but to other departments within the company. I've seen it many ways, and I've talked to a lot of fellow people who are in charge of ERM, and we're kind of all over. It's a bit of a mixed bag.
All right, I got another one. Josh, this one's directed at you. Josh, in your experience, how well does a self-insured adapt to implementing an ERM technology when they do not have a RMIS at all? Is it a big stretch?
No, I don't think it's a big stretch at all. So the steps for implementing ERM outside of traditional RMIS, face the same challenges, whether you're a committee of one or two, or of many more, or what the objectives are within the organization. And what we often find, is that different risks, or potentially even similar risks, present themselves across, those types of organizations, and getting a handle on those risks and what they mean to your organization, and what you're willing to take on from a risk standpoint, that process still remains the same. So when we talk about scalable programs, and what the size of the program is often irrelevant of having the right types of discussions and what's the output to a board or committee ultimately. So I don't really see any other challenges there, other than the size and scope of it being that type of an organization, and that level of manpower, so to speak, relative to something that's more robust and is utilizing a RMIS today.
All right, one more, I think, and then we'll get to some closing comments. So we had a question from the audience. Any advice on an approach to setting key risk indicators, and any examples? Who wants to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I don't mind starting the conversation on that, and then maybe Brandon can pick up. So generally speaking, when we talk about, and when I think of key risk indicators or key performance indicators, these are metrics across our organization. And so within ERM, and frankly broader GRC, one, you have to identify the actual indicator, and then two, what are the appropriate range values associated with each of those metrics. And we see a lot of this in the insurance space, healthcare. It's really heavily focused in the banking area where folks are using key risk indicators. But one, identify that risk, and then potentially tracking what values are generally associated with each of those indicators. So I'll just use a banking example. So if we think about interest rate risk, we might be tracking maybe currency rates, or rates that are set by the Fed, and how might that impact us. And so generally speaking, there may be thresholds either above or below our target level of risk that we need to start tracking to understand, what's our comfort level. And then the way that we typically see this integrated into the risk management process is to say, once we start getting outside of those thresholds, then it raises the red flag, and we have automated alerts within our organization that say, we likely need to take a look at this, and then perhaps this even automatically triggers a risk assessment. And this is where that tight collaboration between not only your key risk indicators and your key performance indicators, but how they actually associate with the risks. So if you start to make an association between indicators and risks, and you have these triggers in place, you can start to really become effective with the way that you're tracking your metrics. Brandon, I don't know if you've got a different type of response.
I think I'll just add to the approach around setting up key risk indicators, because everything you said, absolutely agree with. But when you're first getting into KRIs, there's an approach where you can just go in and manually update those values on a regular basis. So using the example that Josh gave of interest rates, or maybe, there's account balances or number of, tickets opened, or whatever the case may be, somebody is manually going in, let's say monthly, and updating that KRI value. I would say that's kind of the baseline, or that's at least where I would recommend starting if this is something new to you. And then over time, as you get a bit more advanced, you start evaluating those KRIs and figuring out which ones can be automated. So if we take those like interest rates or account balances, those are probably present in another system, and we can automatically have that feed into the system where our KRIs live. So I don't have to ask a person to manually go in every month and type it in. Obviously, there's inherent risk of having a person do that. Number one is they could fat finger it, and type in the wrong value. Number two is you're only getting indicators as often as they're going in to update them. So let's say every month, you could be going, almost an entire month above a threshold and not even realize it at that rate. So by evaluating those KRIs where maybe automation can take place, where you get the most bang for your buck, because obviously there is a cost associated with automating those, then you can over time start to flip those KRIs to integrate with the systems where that data resides and have that pulled over automatically. And then you really start to see that value that Josh mentioned of, those automatic notifications when a KRI meets its threshold, because you no longer have to have somebody going in. It's just the system will notify you, hey, this value is past the first threshold, or hey, it's approaching the second one. So that would be my recommendation on approach.
Actually, I want to try to squeeze one more question in for the audience, because I think it's a real good one. If there was, and again, whoever would like to speak to it, is there a traditional methodology in determining an organization's risk appetite? Any suggestions?
Well, Josh and I were just talking about that.
Certainly I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all approach to determining risk appetite. Usually there's two schools of thought. One is, do you want to take it on a risk-by-risk basis, or do you want to take it more by a category of risk? Things like operational or strategic or compliance or legal type of risk. What we often find is starting with buckets of risk usually is a little more palatable for organizations on the lower end of the maturity curve. So start thinking about, what type of impact and likelihood. So from a financial standpoint and from a probability standpoint, what do we think that we could tolerate for a categorization of risk across our organization? And that becomes a repeatable type of reevaluation, whether the intervals are quarterly, semi-annually, or annually. As the programs start to expand, we really promote getting into individual risks, because that's where the outliers start to stand. As we, of course, bandwidth, speaking about bandwidth, you probably don't have the opportunity to immediately go at the risk by risk level, but there's more value in thinking about each of those individual risks and how those could impact your organization. And so it's really important to evaluate what level of risk you're willing to take on, and then evaluating that against how well controlled or what your risk mitigation type of strategies are.
Yeah, and I'll just on the back of that, the way that we do it at Pacific, we do it, everyone's different, but we do it based off the likelihood and impact scale that we have developed, which is unique to us. We have various values, which those mean, and assuming we have like a 5-5 type of a heat map or something, if you want a visual, we say anything under a 4-4 is within our appetite. Anything above that, anything between a 4-4 and a 4-5 is within our tolerance, and anything outside of that, above that, is outside of our tolerance. So we kind of did broad strokes when we did ours, but based on real measurable likelihood and impact scores.
All right, thank you. So that's all the audience questions. Josh, maybe you can give us just a little sense of where Origami is today with supporting clients that are implementing ERM strategies, and what can we expect from you guys in the future?
Absolutely, thanks, Pat. So I think you can probably hear the excitement that Origami has relative to not just ERM, but more broadly GRC. So, and I think you've heard that from Roy as well, as he's implemented the solution to help their organization's needs. Now, today, we're excited that Origami can cover the full baseline of ERM type of functionality with those automatic workflows and notifications that we had talked about today. One of our primary objectives is making the enterprise risk managers and their teams' jobs easier, and we do that through automated approaches to that risk and that control inventory management. And what we mean by that is, how do we identify the risks? How do we set up surveys to help extract the information with that organization? When I look at the maturity spectrum, obviously everybody was a little early on in that sort of maturity curve. So what we often find is that folks need a little bit of help understanding what are the risks within their organization. And so we create easy tools to conduct risk identification and create risk registers and control registers as a result. Additionally, it's really flexible with respect to how we score and configure risk assessments, how we create and promote a full suite of ERM related reports, helping drive that risk tolerance discussion. So, that last question on tolerance and appetite, how do we evaluate that against that raw level of risk? There's solutions in place to drive those conversations. And then really next step with programs is not only have we identified the controls, but a way or a means to test those controls or test compliance areas and standards within our organization, and how do those actually fit into the risk assessment process. So we allow for that type of functionality, but then the big thing is just the consultative-based approach to the way that we are working with our customers. So the group brings quite a bit of ERM and GRC-related experience, and they take real-world scenarios and apply those to our customers as they go through their implementations to think about not only what are processes that fit the unique the unique organization, but what's the right technology solution or setup that helps support those processes based off of what we have found works and doesn't work. More of a future state, we're heading more the direction of GRC instead of just ERM, and this is adding on other layers of functionality. So how do we evaluate vendors and track vendor intake and do assessments on vendors, looking at business continuity planning, introducing those KRIs and KPIs, and so on and so forth. We're really excited about this space, and it's been a pleasure to work with the group as it's matured over the last year to 18 months.
Thanks very much, Josh. And I wanted to thank the panel, all of the panel, for sharing their time and their insights today with the webinar, with all the participants on the webinar. I also want to thank everyone who participated in our first webinar series. I'm very excited about that. We hope you found that the discussion was interesting and that you've learned some practical ideas from our discussion. And finally, I wanted to thank our sponsor, Origami Risk. You can learn more about them at www.origamirisk.com. As I mentioned at the beginning, a recording of this webinar will be made available shortly. Will also be included in a follow-up email to the group. And then finally, again, thank everyone for participating. If you want to follow the activities of the RMIS Technology Association, you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is RMIS Technology. Or right now, you can just drop me an email at poneal@redhandadvisors.com. So I hope everyone enjoyed it. And it looks like we wrapped it up right at the hour mark. So thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, Pat.